Thank you all for coming. We're here today with Jay Richards, who is a visiting fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and a contributing editor of American.com.
God is concerned about the poor. Jesus talks a lot about the poor. So if you're a Christian, you ought to be concerned about the poor. Socialists talk a lot about the poor. Therefore, Christians should be socialists. All right, that was sort of now obviously I didn't have it with that kind of analytic precision at the time, and so it's embarrassing to think that that was more or less my thinking. But when I didn't understand some basic details of economics, the rhetoric of socialism was quite appealing, and frankly, it animated me. It animated me for several years, and I identified socialism as, frankly, an extension of my Christian worldview. I had worked my way out of the kind of the intellectual illusion that socialism actually worked. I mean, remember, this is still the late 1980s. In 1988, I had a course on Eastern European economies, and the conclusion, by the way, was that Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union had more or less equaled the United States in terms of its economic power. I thought, what a useless course. I mean, 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapses. But I knew on economic grounds that command economies and various forms of socialism just simply couldn't compete in terms of creating wealth, distributing goods and services like capitalist economies. The problem is that the person that probably convinced me of this more than anyone ultimately my senior year was Ayn Rand, who wrote a book, Atlas Shrugged. There's a story behind that I won't go into, but Rand absolutely destroyed the sort of pretense of collectivism for me. Even the idea that it was sort of morally praiseworthy even in an ideal sense. But Rand, as most of you probably know, defended capitalism on grounds of selfishness. She was a hardcore atheist. She thought Christian altruism was antithetical to capitalism. She had capitalism actually based on greed, and she went so far as to defend greed and selfishness as a virtue. And so I ended up with this mental tension. Capitalism, while it seems to work, at least the best of all the alternatives, nevertheless it's fundamentally immoral. And so I thought as a Christian, you end up with this very difficult tension.
What would you say is the role of the church and Christian altruism within this free market system? How would you say that within this role it's doing, and how can it improve?
I would say, and I know Marvin has written on this, and Michael Novak, that there's these sort of three very important spheres in any working society. There's the sort of economic realm or the economic sphere, there's the civil society sphere, and there's the political sphere. And there's certain, I think, God-given responsibilities that the state has. Those things for which coercion is appropriate, the state ought to do. So I have the right to defend myself, defend my family from molestation or murder, so I can rightfully delegate that to the state. And there's a natural kind of internal logic to these things. But the state is not the same as society. Society is much larger, and it's actually pre-political, and society includes everything from families to churches to voluntary organizations and martial arts schools and all those kinds of things. And I actually think if you had to just pick one, that's by far the most important. If you don't have a civil society that does the right things, you don't have a working political sphere, you don't have a working sort of economic sphere. Now, with respect to this question of charity, Marvin had mentioned earlier that there was a time in the United States in which it was perfectly well understood, what do you do for those people who are much less fortunate than we are, the people that are living on the streets, people in abject poverty. And Christians understood, at least in principle, that they were responsible in some way for that. That's a non-negotiable, that we as Christians, given whatever our particular circumstances are responsible. We are in some way our brother's keeper. Now, what I think has happened, and certainly happened at a quickening pace starting in the 1960s, is that large segments of what ought to have properly been the responsibility of the civil society and the churches was confiscated by the government, including the federal government. And it's not as if the sort of work just sort of changed owners. There is a different logic in the political sphere than there is in the civil society sphere. The most important one is the civil society sphere is cooperative and voluntary. The logic of the political sphere is coercive. And so it's going to qualitatively change when certain tasks are shifted from one sphere to the other. The problem now as Christians is that most of this stuff is taken care of. The things what the churches ought to have been doing. And so Christians like Jim Wallace will say, well, look, the church doesn't have enough money to take care of all these poor people. The government has to do it. To which I say, well, where did the government get that money? Right? Got it from somewhere. Every dollar spent had to come from somewhere. And so I think that's part of the problem. I think some of these things ought to be given back to civil society, and those institutions like the church will have to indeed bear that responsibility. But let me illustrate to you what's happened now. I was at Acton Institute for 3 years, and Marvin has been deeply involved in this project called the Center for Effective Compassion, and we give an annual award at Acton called the Samaritan Award, $10,000 to a sort of the best private charity that we say practices best the principles of effective compassion. They can't get very much government money. They're usually very small organizations. But last year, it seemed like there was about 311 of these little nonprofits. Virtually every one of them defined their mission in part by what the government was or wasn't already doing. And so it's a ministry that says, well, there's these cracks in the health and human services here that we can fill. So you can see private ministries define themselves now in part over against what the state has already occupied. So I think the whole ecosphere has been filled by the state, and I think that was a serious mistake. So what I think ought to happen culturally and politically is that certain responsibilities that we are presupposing ought to be in the hands of the state simply should not be. And I think that we'd actually solve a lot of these problems, or at least it'd be a lot better. We're never going to cure poverty any more than we're going to cure all disease and death. It's something that we'll always have with us as a problem. But that said, I think we could have a much better arrangement.
What do you think will be the effect of temporary subsidies currently available to people in the dairy industry,
right?
Due to like milk prices and such?
Well, of course, so government subsidy, we're going to talk about something like, so an agricultural subsidy, if that kind of thing you're thinking about. Well, obviously, this distorts the market price, right? So, you subsidize the production of something, presumably because the people that are producing it could not afford to make a living producing that unless it were subsidized. I would say the vast majority of the time that it's actually, in the long run, an irrational behavior, because if somebody else can produce it less expensively, we ought to be using those resources in the subsidy someplace else. Because the fact that we're subsidizing, think of it this way. Okay, let's say I've got a house, I've just sold it in Michigan, so I'll use Michigan as an example, and there's people that for years have been building cars, but nobody wants to buy the cars, right? They're junky, they use too much gas, they're just somehow not quite as cute as the ones from Japan, all these kinds of things, right? You say, well, but these people can't make a living making these cars. So let's have the government subsidize them, right, so that they can afford to make it, even though nobody's buying it. Well, that's not dignifying their work, is it? Because they know they're building stuff that nobody can use. But it's also wasting the resources, because what those people ought to be doing is doing something in which they have a comparative advantage. And so it looks sort of short-term like it might be a compassionate act, but to do that, you're having to take money from someplace else in the economy, and you end up privileging, in this case, auto workers over somebody else. And I think it's the same thing with sort of agricultural subsidies, with oil subsidies. I think most of this stuff doesn't make sense and is not a legitimate use of the power of the state. Now, that's the economic point. I do think there are exceptions, but the exceptions almost always have to do with national security. So, for instance, it's perfectly reasonable that we don't exercise international free trade with missile technology with Iran. Do I need to make this argument? Okay. Yeah, and so there will be reasons, but notice it's not for economic reasons. It's specifically for national security reasons, and in fact, it still distorts the market. So even if, say, someone in Japan, they have a subsidy, I think really high tariffs on imported rice in Japan, right? Well, that makes rice more expensive in Japan than it would otherwise be if it was a free market. But maybe Japan says, well, we're an island. It's possible we could get into a war, and so it's worth it that we continue to have a domestic rice industry. That might make sense for foreign policy reasons, but it still doesn't make any sense for economic reasons. And it's just basic economic rules, I think, that government can't legislate these rules away, despite their desire to do so.